Time for the fourth in these series, in which I show exactly what a grade 9 response looks like for essays on Great Expectations for GCSE English Literature. And what better place to introduce this than outside the birthplace of Charles Dickens? In this video, we're going to explore the relationship between parents and parental figures and their children. Stay tuned and watch Schofield on Shakespeare.
I've talked endlessly about the mark schemes in the 3 previous videos. Press pause if you would like to read through the criteria, first for AO1, AO2, and AO3. Here's the question. Explore Dickens's presentation of relationships between parental figures and children in this extract and elsewhere in the novel. In this extract, Pip meets the Pocket family for the first time. He will be receiving tuition from Mr. Pocket. After dinner, the children were introduced, and Mrs. Coiler made admiring comments on their eyes, noses and legs, a sagacious way of improving their minds. There were 4 little girls and 2 little boys, beside the baby who might have been either, and the baby's next successor who was as yet neither. They were brought in by Flopson and Millers, much as though those 2 non-commissioned officers had been recruiting somewhere for children and had enlisted these, while Mrs. Pocket looked at the young nobles that ought to have been, as if she rather thought she had had the pleasure of inspecting them before, but didn't quite know what to make of them. "Here, give me your fork, Mum, and take the baby," said Flopson. "Don't take it that way, or you'll get its head under the table." Thus advised, Mrs. Pocket took it the other way, and got its head upon the table, which was announced to all present by a prodigious concussion. "Dear, dear, give it me back, Mum," said Flopson, "and Miss Jane, come and dance to baby, do." One of the little girls, a mere mite who seemed to have prematurely taken upon herself some charge of the others, stepped out of her place by me and danced to and from the baby until it left off crying and laughed. Then all the children laughed, and Mr. Pocket, who in the meantime had twice endeavoured to lift himself up by the hair, laughed, and we all laughed and were glad. Flopson, by dint of doubling the baby at the joints like a Dutch doll, then got it safely into Mrs. Pocket's lap, and gave it the nutcrackers to play with, at the same time recommending Mrs. Pocket to take notice that the handles of that instrument were not likely to agree with its eyes, and sharply charging Miss Jane to look after the same. Then the 2 nurses left the room, and had a lively scuffle on the staircase with a dissipated page who had waited at dinner, who had clearly lost half his buttons at the gaming table. I was made very uneasy in my mind by Mrs. Pocket's falling into a discussion with Drummle respecting 2 baronetcies, while she ate a sliced orange steeped in sugar and wine, and, forgetting all about the baby on her lap, who did most appalling things with the nutcrackers. At length, little Jane, perceiving its young brains to be imperilled, softly left her place, and with many small artifices coaxed the dangerous weapon away. Mrs. Pocket, finishing her orange at about the same time, and not approving of this, said to Jane, "You naughty child, how dare you? Go and sit down this instant." Have a go at writing your own response, but before doing so, plan and think a little. Here's how my initial plan looks. Read it. The video will resume in 5 seconds' time. Here's the question and the first part of the extract. The second part will appear 5 seconds later, so you can toggle between the slides. Press pause to get writing. Here's my response. The relationships between parental figures and children in the novel are largely negative. As a young child, Pip does have a close relationship with Jo, but is abused by his sister. Meanwhile, another orphan, Estella, is dutiful and obedient towards Miss Havisham, although later events indicate that the latter's parenting techniques have drastically reduced her potential to love anyone, including the woman who brought her up. And in this extract, utterly self-absorbed Mrs. Pocket is shown to be an incompetent, superficial, and unintentionally dangerous parental figure. Mrs. Pocket's self-absorption is shown in the way that she looks at the children when they are brought in by two servants. The narrator writes that she looked at them as if she rather thought she had had the pleasure of inspecting them before, but didn't quite know what to make of them. The apparent lack of recognition by a mother towards her own children is both comic and implicitly points to her own incompetence as a parent. Meanwhile, the lavish formal phrase, "had the pleasure of," and the previous description of the children as young nobles that ought to have been, give an insight into her character. She is someone utterly preoccupied by notions of grandeur, so much so that she feels the minutiae of safe everyday parenting is beyond her scope. But Mrs. Pocket is so incompetent that her actions in this extract endanger the health of her own children. When trying to hold her own baby, she ignores the advice of Flopson, probably on principle given her delusions about her own status, and holds him or her in a way which was announced to all present by a prodigious concussion. Once again, the tone is ironic. The grandeur of the language, as seen in the use of the passive tense and the inappropriate verb to announce to describe a head being banged, is comic, and sharply contrasts with Mrs. Pocket's stunning ineptitude as a mother. The phrase prodigious concussion is clearly hyperbolic for ironic effect, but highlights the fact that her actions have unwittingly given her own baby a significant whack on the head. Similar comic hyperbole is seen in the concern by one of the elder children, Jane, later in the passage. She perceived that its young brains might be imperilled by unsupervised fiddling with some nutcrackers whilst on her mother's lap. The specific reference to brains rather than head or skull amusingly highlights the extreme force with which the baby is banging the nutcrackers on or close to its head. However, Mrs. Pocket responds to the concerned intervention of one of her other children with outrage, labelling her a naughty child and using the abrupt imperatives "go and sit down" to reassert her parental authority. Thus, the implication is that Mrs. Pocket is not just incompetent and indifferent as a parent, but she also haughtily fails to appreciate loving, helpful actions from others, including her own children, deemed below her refined stratosphere. Mrs. Pocket unintentionally causes physical harm to her children. Mrs. Gargery's abuse is deliberate. At the beginning of chapter 2, the narrator ironically relays his younger self's interpretation of the phrase being brought up by hand as meaning his sister's employment of a hard and heavy hand to admonish, correct and punish not just himself, but Jo as well. It is clear that Mrs. Gargery, in a not dissimilar way to Mrs. Pocket, finds bringing up Pip burdensome and unfulfilling, hence her regular resorting to violence to relieve her frustrations. Additionally, it becomes quickly obvious that she wants to spend as little time as possible both being with Pip and listening to him. When Pip tries to find out about prison ships, she is outraged at being asked anything at all. She answers the question by saying that people are put in the hulks because they murder and because they rob, but then adds the ludicrous concluding clause, and they always begin by asking questions. Thus, the implication is that Pip may already be on the way to a life of crime and misery, and that he needs to shut up to have a chance of avoiding this fate. This is astonishingly irresponsible parenting, and is likely to scare a vulnerable young child. Nonetheless, it gives an insight into a society in which orphans, and some children in general, were expected to feel grateful for just being brought up, irrespective of the obvious failings and abuse of the parental figures. Contextually, life was much harder for children in Victorian Britain. Dickens himself had to work in a blacking factory at the age of just 12, whilst in chapter 51 Jaggers justifies his decision to give Estella to Miss Havisham by saying that he habitually knew of children being imprisoned, whipped, transported, neglected, cast out, and his list goes on. Within this context, it is perhaps tempting to be too harsh on Pip's sister. At least she has given him a home to live in. The novel does contain some positive representations of relationships between parental figures and children, of which so many appear to be orphans, e.g. Pip, Estella, Biddy. Joe remains devoted to Pip throughout his life and constant in spite of the latter's later hurtful rejections and unwarranted patronisation. At the end of chapter 18, an unhappy Pip sees light wreaths from Joe's pipe floating, like a blessing from Joe, pervading the air we shared together. This image sums up the love that can exist between a parental figure and a child. The child should be able to feel and sense the ever-present love and presence of the parent, but in a non-intrusive and obviously non-violent way. The simile, like a blessing, implies that there is almost a spiritual element to Joe's love, and that, like God, his love will remain constant irrespective of the sins of the child. However, this image also points to Joe's passivity as a parent. He was unable to prevent Mrs. Gargery's abuse, and so in some ways was irresponsibly ineffectual, in spite of later explanations about his own childhood. How does this get full marks for both AQA and OCR? Well, AO1, I focus sharply on the question and develop my ideas, as I do here when I point out that Mrs. Pocket is not just incompetent, but potentially dangerous. I use short embedded quotations. I show a critical perceptive understanding of Joe's parenting. Yes, on the one hand, he is godlike in his lovingness, but he's also overly passive. AO2, you need to be very specific and detailed when exploring language, as I am here when exploring the effects of the use of the verb announce and the phrase prodigious concussion. I employ subject terminology accurately as shown in the use of the terms passive tense, verb and hyperbolic. AO3, signposted conveniently for the examiner with the starting verb contextually. The fact that Dickens himself had to leave school, albeit temporarily, to work in a factory aged 12, and Jaggers knows so many children who have been appallingly treated, may imply that comparatively Pip was let off rather lightly.
That's it. I hope it's been useful. If it has, do feel free to write a comment below. But remember, YouTube videos are only a fraction of what is required to do really well at GCSE. Remember, you need to be reading and rereading the text, thinking about it and annotating. Good luck and many thanks for watching Schofield on Shakespeare.